From a luxurious room, a powerful businessman decides to investigate something strange happening in one of his stores. Disguised, he infiltrates the environment where no one recognizes him and where everything seems far too normal. But a cry coming from the storage room leads him to a disturbing discovery. What he finds there challenges everything he believed about his own company. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. Richard Maxwell, a 45-year-old multimillionaire and owner of Maxwell Markets, one of the largest supermarket chains in the country, observed New York City from the panoramic window of his office on the top floor of the imposing building that bore his name. The metropolis pulsed below him, frantic and indifferent, just as he had become over the years. His brown eyes, once full of dreams, now reflected only numbers and business strategies. The empire he had built with such sweat now seemed distant from his hands, as if he were merely watching a movie about his own life. His wristwatch showed almost 10 at night, but Richard showed no hurry to return to the empty apartment he called home. What would be there besides more loneliness? His ex-wife Caroline had left 3 years ago, tired of competing with spreadsheets and meetings for her husband's attention. His son Gregory studied abroad and rarely called. The calls, when they happened, were brief and formal. "Mr. Maxwell, I've brought the last quarter's reports," said Renee, his secretary, placing a folder on the solid mahogany desk. Her high heels echoed on the marble floor of the minimalist office. "Thank you, Renee, you can go home." "It's late. You should go too. You have the shareholders' meeting early tomorrow." Richard nodded, not really listening. When the door closed, he sighed deeply. Silence was his only constant companion. He opened the folder and began to flip through the numbers. Profits, expansions, acquisitions, everything indicated absolute success. In total, Maxwell Markets boasted 230 stores spread throughout the country, employing more than 50,000 people, a true American retail empire, built in 20 years of arduous work and strategic decisions that did not always consider the human factor. Richard stood up and walked to the small bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself an expensive whiskey, a gift from some supplier eager to please. The amber liquid burned his throat, but even that couldn't make him feel anything beyond the usual emptiness. "Why am I still doing this?" he asked himself aloud. The question echoed off the office walls. It wasn't the first time this doubt had assailed him. He had everything money could buy, but the feeling of accomplishment remained distant. Caroline's words during their last argument still echoed in his mind. "You built an empire, Richard, but you lost your soul in the process." His cell phone vibrated on the desk. A notification of an anonymous message appeared on the screen. Richard frowned. Very few people had his personal number, and anonymous messages were practically impossible to receive due to security filters. "See what's happening at your store 101. Just that. No sender, no further details. Richard narrowed his eyes, intrigued. Store 101 was located in the South Bronx, a working-class area of New York City, far from the comfort and luxury he was accustomed to. His instinct told him to ignore the message. It was probably some dissatisfied employee wanting attention or a prank. His crisis management team would deal with any problem. That's what he had always done, delegate. Keep his distance, observe the numbers and let others solve everyday problems. But something about that simple message bothered him deeply. Perhaps it was the mysterious tone, or perhaps it was something more, a growing unease within him. Or who knew, maybe the whiskey had given him some courage to do something different. The next morning, Richard woke up with a fixed idea. He would visit Store 101, not as the CEO, with all the pomp and circumstance that such visits normally involved, but disguised as an ordinary customer. He wanted to see the reality, without the veneer his subordinates always applied when he was present. In the luxurious closet of his Upper East Side apartment, Richard sought out the simplest clothes he owned. A difficult task, considering his wardrobe was basically composed of custom-made Italian suits. He found a pair of jeans he rarely wore, a basic t-shirt and a baseball cap. It wasn't the perfect disguise, but it would do. He dismissed his driver that day, something he hadn't done in years. He ordered a ride-sharing car to the address of Store 101. During the journey, he watched the city transform. The luxurious buildings gave way to simpler constructions. The well-maintained streets were replaced by roads with potholes and inadequate upkeep. It was as if he was entering another New York City, one he knew only by numbers in expansion reports. "Are you sure this is it?" the driver asked when they arrived at their destination, a busy but visibly less affluent commercial area. "Yes, thank you," Richard replied, feeling strangely out of place. Standing in front of Store 101, Richard felt a chill in his stomach. The establishment looked like so many others in the chain. The same green and yellow facade, the same logo he himself had approved years ago. But there was something different, something that could not be captured in numbers and graphs. He took a deep breath and entered. The environment was relatively clean and organized, but the air conditioning worked poorly, leaving the atmosphere stuffy. Employees moved mechanically, with rehearsed smiles and distant gazes. Richard began to circulate through the aisles, observing everything. The shelves were well stocked, but some products seemed hastily arranged, without the care required by the company's procedure manual. An employee approached him. Her badge read, "Felicity. Can I help you, sir?" she asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just looking." "Thank you," Richard replied, trying to sound casual. "Just call if you need anything," she said before quickly moving away, as if afraid to spend too much time assisting him. Richard continued his discreet inspection. He observed the movement at the cash registers, the interaction between employees, the way they served customers. It was all correct but lifeless, like robots programmed to perform functions without truly engaging. It was then that he heard it, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible, coming from a side corridor that led to the back of the store. Instinctively, he followed the sound. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, clearly not intended for customer circulation. Signs indicated restricted access and employees only, but Richard ignored the warnings. The sob intensified, guiding him to a small service area, where cleaning products and a small changing room for employees were located. In a dark corner, among stacked boxes, a little girl was huddled. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, with curly hair tied in a messy ponytail and eyes swollen from crying. She tried to hide even more when she saw Richard approach. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. He had never dealt with children, not even when his own son was small. Caroline always took care of that part, but he couldn't just ignore the girl. "Hi," he said softly, crouching down to her eye level. "Is everything okay?" The girl huddled further, clutching a worn rag doll to her chest. "I won't hurt you," Richard continued. "I just want to help. What's your name?" "Lucy," she replied almost in a whisper. "Nice to meet you, Lucy. I'm—" "Robert," Richard lied, deciding not to use his real name. "What are you doing hiding here?" Lucy hesitated, looking nervously at the door as if fearing someone would appear at any moment. "My mom works here," she finally said. "She told me to hide. If Mr. Lane finds me, she'll lose her job." "Mr. Lane?" Richard asked, feeling a pang of concern. "The manager," Lucy explained. "He doesn't like children in the store. He says they get in the way of work. But my mom has no one to leave me with. The neighbor who used to watch me is sick." Richard felt a knot form in his throat. He remembered all the policies he had approved over the years, always prioritizing efficiency and profit. He had never really thought about the impact of these decisions on the lives of employees. "Has your mom worked here long?" he asked, trying to gain the girl's trust. 3 years, Lucy replied, seeming to relax a little. "She's a cashier." "Her name is Julianne." Richard made a mental note. "Julianne, cashier, Lucy's mother. And your dad." Lucy's face saddened even more. "He left when I was little. Mom says he wasn't ready to be a dad." Richard nodded, feeling a strange connection to that story. How many times had he himself not been present for his son, always too busy with the company? "Have you been here long?" "Since school ended," Lucy replied. "Mom picks me up, brings me here, and I hide until her shift ends." "And this happens every day?" Lucy nodded. "Sometimes I stay with Aunt Claudia, but she had to go take care of her sick mother in upstate New York, so I have to come here." Richard felt a wave of guilt wash over him. As CEO, he had implemented cuts in benefits such as childcare assistance, considering them unnecessary expenses that could be reduced to increase profit margins. At that moment, they heard footsteps approaching. Lucy paled, her eyes widening in fear. "It's him! It's Mr. Lane," she whispered, hiding further among the boxes. Richard quickly stood up, positioning himself to block the view of whoever was approaching. A middle-aged man with neatly trimmed grey hair and a severe expression appeared at the door. He wore the chain's manager uniform, with the company logo embroidered on his chest and a badge that confirmed, Charles Lane, manager. "You shouldn't be here, sir," Charles said, in an authoritative tone that made it clear he was used to giving orders and being obeyed. "This area is restricted to employees." Richard, for the first time in a long time, felt intimidated, not by Charles's demeanor, but by the situation itself. It was as if the roles were reversed. He, the powerful CEO, was now just an intruder being reprimanded by a manager. "Excuse me, I was looking for the restroom," Richard improvised. Charles narrowed his eyes. "Suspicious. The customer restrooms are on the other side of the store, sir. I'll ask you to accompany me." Richard cast a reassuring glance at Lucy, who remained hidden and followed Charles. As they walked back to the sales area, Richard observed the way the manager interacted with employees. There was a palpable tension in the air. Smiles became more forced, movements more rigid. The fear was almost tangible. "Here's the restroom, sir," Charles said, indicating a door on the side of the store. "Next time, ask for information before circulating in restricted areas." Richard thanked him and entered the restroom just to maintain his disguise. He looked at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back. It wasn't just the different clothes or the cap. There was something in his eyes, an unease that wasn't there before. Upon leaving the restroom, Richard decided to remain in the store for a while longer, now with more attentive eyes. He observed Julianne at the cash register, a young woman of approximately 30, with the same curly hair as Lucy. Her movements were precise and quick, but her gaze betrayed a constant worry, especially when Charles approached. Richard approached her register, placing some purchases to pay. "Good morning," Julianne said, with the same rehearsed smile that all employees seemed to use. "Good morning," Richard replied, trying to establish more meaningful eye contact. As Julianne scanned the products, Charles approached, observing her every move like a predator. Richard could notice how her shoulders tensed instantly. "Faster, Julianne," Charles said in a low but authoritative tone. "We have customers waiting." The line behind Richard had only 2 more people, and none of them seemed in a hurry. But Julianne accelerated her movements even more, almost knocking over one of the products. "Sorry," she murmured, her eyes downcast. Richard felt anger grow within him. This was the reality he never saw in official visits or reports. The fear, the pressure, the dehumanization, all in the name of efficiency and profit that he valued so much. He paid for his purchases and left the store feeling deeply disturbed. The anonymous message he had received began to make sense. There was something very wrong at Store 101, and possibly throughout his entire chain. And the worst part, it was he, with his cold and distant policies, who was responsible for creating a system that allowed this type of behavior. Back in his luxurious apartment, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Lucy and Julianne, about all the other Lucys and Juliannes who might be suffering in the 230 stores of his chain. He sat on his Italian leather sofa, the same expensive whiskey in his hands, but the taste now seemed bitter. His cell phone rang. It was Frederick Miller, his financial director. "Richard, where were you? You missed the shareholders' meeting." Richard blinked, confused. He had completely forgotten about the meeting. "I had an unforeseen event," he replied dryly. "An unforeseen event? Richard, we're talking about a meeting with the company's main shareholders. The board was not at all pleased with your absence." "Frederick, right now I have other concerns." "What other concerns could be more important than the network's expansion into the Midwest?" Richard took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "Frederick, I need you to send me all the data for Store 101. Performance reports, staff roster, everything." "Store 101? In the South Bronx? Why?" "Just do what I'm asking," Richard replied in a tone that admitted no questioning. After hanging up, Richard remained seated, absorbed in thought. Something had to be done, but what? He could simply fire Charles Lane, solve the specific problem of Store 101. But what about the other stores? And the company policies that allowed people like Charles to prosper? The solution came to him like a flash. He needed to see more, understand more. And for that, he would need to move even further away from his comfort zone. He would need to become one of them. An ordinary employee, subjected to the same pressures, living the same reality. He picked up his cell phone again, dialing his personal lawyer's number. "Mark, I need fake documents." a new identity, and I need it fast and discreetly. On the other end of the line, the lawyer hesitated. Richard, that's unusual and potentially illegal. Don't worry about the legality. I'll take the risks. It's important, Mark. After hanging up, Richard looked out the window at the city stretching below. New York City, with its lights, its inequality, its contradictions. The same city that had witnessed his ascent would now be the stage for his most unexpected journey. In the following days, Richard meticulously prepared. He received the fake documents, an ID card, social security number, employment card, all in the name of Roger Green, 45 years old, high school graduate, no prior retail experience. He created a backstory. Roger was a simple man, recently arrived in New York City from upstate New York, seeking a new chance after a difficult divorce. He rented a small apartment in a neighborhood near the South Bronx, furnishing it with the basics. He bought simple clothes suitable for his new persona. He informed the board that he would be taking a leave of absence for personal reasons, temporarily delegating his duties to the vice president. No one questioned much. After all, he was Richard Maxwell, the man who never took vacations, who practically lived for the company. If he needed time, it must be for a good reason. But no one could imagine the real reason, that the powerful CEO of Maxwell Markets was about to become a simple cleaner at Store 101, all to discover the truth about his own company. On Monday morning, Roger Green, or rather Richard Maxwell in disguise, headed to Maxwell Markets Store 101 to apply for a job. He wore a simple shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of intentionally worn sneakers to appear more authentic. He had spent the weekend studying his new character, rehearsing a slightly upstate New York accent and practicing simpler gestures, far from the imposing posture he used to maintain as CEO. Richard's heart pounded as he approached the service entrance. It was strange to be nervous entering an establishment that, technically, belonged to him. But the feeling of vulnerability was real. Now he didn't have the shield of his name or position to protect him. "Good morning. I'm here for the cleaning assistant position," he said to the human resources receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, as indicated by her badge. Margaret barely looked up from her computer. "Fill out this form and wait to be called." Richard took the form and sat on an uncomfortable chair in the small waiting room. As he filled in Roger Green's fictitious details, he observed the movement of employees entering and exiting. Everyone seemed rushed, tense, rarely exchanging more than essential words with each other. After half an hour of waiting, he was called for a quick interview with Margaret herself. "So, Mr. Green, you have no retail experience?" "No, ma'am. I worked as a caretaker on a farm in upstate New York, but after my divorce, I decided to try life in the city." Margaret scrutinized him for a few moments. "Well, the position doesn't require prior experience, and we're in urgent need. The salary is the category minimum, plus transport allowance and meal vouchers. The shift is from 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, with an hour for lunch." "Interested?" Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of relief at having gotten the job so easily, and shock at the mechanical way the entire process was being conducted. "You can start tomorrow. Bring your original documents for registration." The next day, promptly at 6 in the morning, Richard, now completely immersed in the role of Roger, reported for his first day of work. He was greeted by Norman, a man of approximately 60, the cleaning team supervisor. "Welcome." "Roger, I'll show you everything quickly because we're already late," Norman said, leading him through the store's aisles, which were not yet open to the public. "Your locker is number 17. Put on your uniform and meet me in the storage room in 5 minutes. Richard put on the dark blue uniform with the discreet Maxwell Markets logo. The clothing was rough, made of cheap fabric that irritated his skin, accustomed to Egyptian cotton shirts. The contrast could not have been greater with the custom-made clothes he wore in his real life. In the storage room, Norman handed him a cart with cleaning products, brooms, mops, and cloths. "Your area today is aisles 5 to 10. Clean the floor, replenish toilet paper and soap in the restrooms, collect trash, and clean up any spills that happen during your shift. And remember, always smile at customers and be invisible. Mr. Lane doesn't like to see the cleaning crew during operating hours. If you need to clean something, be quick and discreet." "Be invisible?" Richard questioned, genuinely confused. Norman gave a tired smile. You'll understand. Now let's go. The store opens at 7, and everything needs to be impeccable. The first few hours were a reality shock for Richard. The work was physically exhausting, something his body, accustomed to a sedentary office life, was not prepared to face. His hands, once soft and well-groomed, were soon rough and red from contact with chemicals. His back ached from the constant bending and lifting. But the physical strain was only part of the challenge. The hardest part was witnessing how cleaning employees were treated, or rather ignored. Customers passed by him as if he were invisible. Other employees rarely greeted him. And when Charles Lane, the manager, appeared, everyone on the cleaning team seemed to disappear, hiding in empty corridors or the storage room. During lunch, Richard sat alone in the small employee cafeteria, observing the interactions around him. That's when he noticed Julianne, the cashier, Lucy's mother, entering quickly and sitting at a table in the corner, alone. She ate quickly, constantly checking her watch. Taking a deep breath, Richard stood up and approached her. "May I sit here?" he asked. Julianne looked up, surprised. "Of course," she replied, immediately returning her attention to her food. "I'm Roger. I started cleaning today," he introduced himself. "Julianne, cashier," she replied, without elaborating. Richard noticed how tense and anxious she seemed, constantly looking at the door as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Have you worked here long?" he asked, trying to establish some connection. 3 years, Julianne replied before adding in a low voice, "I shouldn't be talking. The break is short, and Mr. Lane doesn't like us socializing during working hours." Richard nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. It was his company, his policies that had created this environment of fear and isolation. "Sorry, I didn't mean to cause you problems," he said sincerely. Something in his tone must have touched Julianne, because she looked at him more attentively. "It's okay," she said, softening a little. It's complicated here." At that moment, the cafeteria door opened and Charles Lane entered. The effect was immediate. Conversations ceased, shoulders tensed, gazes returned to their plates. The manager surveyed the room with critical eyes, stopping briefly at Julianne, who immediately lowered her gaze. "Break ends in 5 minutes, Charles announced, unnecessarily, as a large clock on the wall indicated the same. "And remember, efficiency is our priority. Don't forget the targets." After his departure, the atmosphere remained tense for a few moments before conversations resumed, now in even lower tones. "See what I mean?" Julianne murmured. "He's always watching." During the days that followed, Richard fully immersed himself in his role as Roger, the cleaner. He arrived early, performed his tasks with dedication, despite the physical fatigue, and observed. Mainly, he observed, he saw how Charles Lane governed Store 101 with an iron fist. Employees were publicly reprimanded for the slightest mistake. Overtime was not properly compensated. Unrealistic targets were imposed, especially for cashiers, who had to maintain an average service time almost impossible to achieve without compromising quality. But it was at the end of the first week that Richard witnessed something that deeply shocked him. He was discreetly cleaning the corridor near the manager's office when he heard Charles's voice, agitated. "Julianne, your productivity targets are below expectations for the 3rd consecutive day." "I'm sorry, Mr. Lane," Julianne's voice replied, trembling. "It's just that I had to leave quickly yesterday to check on my daughter." "Your personal life doesn't interest me," Charles cut in. "When you're here, your only concern should be productivity. I can't have employees who aren't 100% committed." "I am committed, Mr. Lane." Julianne's voice was increasingly desperate. "It's just that my daughter. If you can't separate personal problems from work, perhaps this isn't the place for you. I have 10 resumes on my desk from people who would give anything for this position. Please, I need this job. I'm a single mother. I have bills, rent." Richard felt his blood boil, hearing the cruelty in Charles's next words. "That's not the company's problem." The efficiency policy was created by the CEO himself, Mr. Richard Maxwell. He didn't build this empire worrying about employees' personal problems. It's produce or leave. Simple as that. Hearing his own name used to justify such cruelty was like a punch to Richard's gut. Was this what his efficiency policies had created? An environment where human beings were treated as disposable machines? When Julianne left the manager's office, Richard could see the tears she was desperately trying to hide. Without thinking twice, he followed her to the women's changing room, completely ignoring the rules. "Julianne," he called softly from the doorway. She turned, surprised and embarrassed to be seen crying. "Roger? You shouldn't be here." "I know, sorry. But I overheard the conversation. By accident. Is everything okay?" Julianne quickly wiped away her tears. "It will be. It always is somehow. Your daughter is Lucy, right?" Richard asked, revealing he knew more than he should. Julianne's gaze immediately changed to one of panic. "How do you know about my daughter? Who told you?" Richard realized his mistake. Roger, the newly hired cleaner, would have no way of knowing about Lucy. I heard someone mention it," he improvised. "Sorry, I didn't mean to pry." Julianne studied him for a moment, suspicious before relaxing slightly. "Yes, Lucy, she's 9. She normally stays with a neighbor when I'm working, but she's sick. I don't have family in New York City, and the school daycare only operates until 5. "And you bring her to the store?" Richard asked, already knowing the answer. Julianne nodded, looking defeated. "I have no choice. If I lose this job, I can't pay the rent. Lucy hides in the storage room until my shift ends. I know it's against the rules, but—" "I'm not judging," Richard interrupted gently. "I'm just concerned. It doesn't seem like a suitable environment for a child." "Do you think I don't know that?" Julianne replied, a spark of frustration in her voice. "But what are my options? The company cut childcare assistance 2 years ago. My salary barely covers basic bills. And Mr. Lane, he makes everything even harder." Richard felt the weight of each word as a direct accusation. It was he who had approved the cut in childcare assistance, based on a report that indicated millions in savings per year. At the time, it seemed a logical, purely financial decision. Now he saw the human face of that spreadsheet. "I'm sorry," he said genuinely. "It's not your fault," Julianne replied, unaware of how wrong she was. "It's the system. Ted always favors those who already have power." "And Lucy's father?" Richard asked, trying to understand the whole situation. "He left when she was 2. Said he wasn't ready to be a dad." Julianne gave a sad smile, as if anyone really is. "He sent money a few times, then disappeared completely." At that moment, someone knocked loudly on the changing room door. "Who's in there?" It was Charles Lane's voice. Julianne paled. "My God, if he finds you here!" Richard acted quickly, hiding in one of the stalls while Julianne opened the door, trying to appear composed. "I was just changing my shirt. Mr. Lane, I spilled coffee." "I heard voices," the manager said. "Suspicious." "I was on the phone with Lucy's school," Julianne lied quickly. "Problem with enrollment." Charles studied her for a moment before saying, "Solve your personal problems outside of working hours, and don't forget what we discussed. I want your targets met today, no exceptions." After Charles left, Richard emerged from his hiding place, feeling like a teenager playing pranks, despite the seriousness of the situation. "Thank you for not giving me away," Julianne said. "Genuinely grateful." "I would never do that," Richard replied. "Look, I know I just started and you barely know me, but if you need help with Lucy, anything—" Julianne observed him with curiosity. "Why do you care so much? Most people here just want to do their job and go home." Richard hesitated, unable to reveal his true identity and motivation. "Let's just say I've been on the other side. I know what it's like to struggle alone." Something in the sincerity of his answer seemed to touch Julianne, who offered the first genuine smile since he had met her. "Thank you." "Roger, really?" In the days that followed, Richard continued his investigation, now with a more specific focus. He watched Charles Lane with renewed attention, mentally documenting every abuse, every cruel comment, every inhumane policy. The manager seemed to live to pressure employees, demanding ever higher targets and severely punishing any slip-up. One afternoon, while cleaning the beverage section, Richard witnessed a scene that crystallized all his indignation. A young stocker, no more than 20 years old, accidentally dropped a bottle of wine which shattered on the floor. Charles, who was passing through the aisle, immediately approached, his face red with anger. "You incompetent fool!" he shouted, not caring about the customers around. "Do you know how much that bottle costs? It's coming out of your salary." The young man, visibly shaken, tried to apologize. "It was an accident, Mr. Lane. It slipped from my hand." "Accidents cost money," the manager retorted. "And money is what drives this company. Mr. Maxwell didn't build this empire by tolerating mistakes. Again, Richard heard his name being used to justify that tyranny. He felt nauseous. Was this how his employees saw him? As a distant tyrant who valued money more than people? The young stocker, trembling, began to pick up the glass shards with his bare hands. "Use gloves, kid." Richard intervened. "No." Longer able to restrain himself. "You'll cut yourself." Charles turned to him, his eyes flashing with anger at the interference. "And you, the new cleaner, mind your own business. Clean up this mess immediately and stop giving opinions." Richard felt his old self wanting to emerge, wanting to put that manager in his place. But he took a deep breath, remembering his mission. This was not the time for revelations. He needed to see more, understand more. "Yes, sir," he replied submissively, grabbing his cleaning equipment. When Charles moved away, Richard approached the young stocker, offering him protective gloves. "Thank you," the young man murmured, still shaken. "What's your name?" Richard asked. "Peter." "Is he always like this, Peter?" The young man gave a humorless laugh. That was him being gentle. "You should see him when he's really angry." Richard nodded, helping him clean up the shards. "How long have you worked here?" 8 months. It's my first formal job." "And have you ever thought about reporting his behavior? Harassment is a crime." Peter looked at Richard as if he had suggested something absurd. "Report him to whom?" "To HR, who does everything he says. To supervisors who are afraid of him. To the company owner who probably doesn't even know we exist." The words hit Richard like arrows. That was exactly it. He, the owner, didn't know they existed. He had never cared to know. He was a distant, almost mythical name, used to justify abuse and pressure. "I understand," he said simply, feeling the weight of his own responsibility. As the days passed, Richard, as Roger, began to gain the trust of his colleagues. His hard work and willingness to help broke down the initial barriers. Gradually, he began to hear stories, confessions, revelations about how Store 101 really operated. He learned that Charles manipulated reports, inflating productivity numbers to impress management. He discovered that overtime was not properly paid and that employees who complained were quickly fired under fabricated pretexts. He witnessed the constant fear that hung in the air, the psychological pressure, the dehumanization. One evening after work, Richard was in the changing room when he overheard a conversation between Norman, the cleaning supervisor, and another older employee. "It wasn't like this before Mr. Lane arrived," Norman was saying. "We had a previous manager, Mr. Anthony, who was strict but fair. When he retired 2 years ago, everything changed." "And no one ever complained to management?" the other employee asked. "We tried at first, but Mr. Lane has connections upstairs. Besides, the store's numbers improved under his management. That's all that matters to the board. Profit, always profit." Richard felt his stomach sink. It was true. Charles Lane was known to the board as an efficient manager who consistently exceeded targets. No one ever questioned his methods, as long as the results were good. The most disturbing thing for Richard was realizing how his own management philosophy had allowed people like Charles Lane to prosper. By prioritizing numbers above all else, by distancing himself from the reality of the stores, he had created the perfect environment for abuse. On a particularly busy morning, Richard was cleaning an area near the cash registers when he noticed Lucy, Julianne's daughter, discreetly leaving the storage room and hiding under an empty counter. The girl seemed frightened, constantly looking around, probably fearing being seen by Charles. Without thinking twice, Richard approached, blocking the view of anyone who might pass. "Hi, Lucy," he said gently. "Do you remember me?" The girl looked at him confused. "Do you know me, sir?" Richard realized too late that she knew him as Robert, the customer who found her weeks ago, not as Roger, the cleaner. "Your mom told me about you," he quickly corrected himself. "I work with her. I'm Roger." Lucy seemed to accept the explanation, relaxing a little. "I shouldn't be here," she said, worried. "Mom told me to hide in the storage room until her shift ends, but it was too dark and there were cockroaches." Richard felt a wave of anger and frustration. A child shouldn't be going through this. No child should have to hide in the dark, scared, while her mother worked. "Let's do this," he said, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm going to take you to a safer and more comfortable place. Do you trust me?" Lucy hesitated for a moment before timidly nodding. Richard discreetly guided her to the small office used by the cleaning team, a cramped but private space, rarely visited by management. "You can stay here," he said, improvising a comfortable seat with some boxes and a clean blanket he found. "I'll bring you something to eat and drink, and maybe some pencils and paper to draw. What do you think?" Lucy's face lit up with a smile. "Can I really draw?" "Of course," Richard replied, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. It was so little, such a simple gesture, but it meant so much to that child. He quickly left, getting snacks and drawing supplies from the store, paying out of his own pocket. When he returned, he found Lucy exactly where he had left her, obedient and quiet, like a child accustomed to not drawing attention. "Here," he said, handing her the items. "Stay here quietly, okay? I'll check on you occasionally, and I'll let your mom know where you are. If anything, you have this walkie-talkie. Press this button and talk to me." Lucy nodded, already biting into a sandwich voraciously, as if she hadn't eaten in hours, which, Richard realized sadly, was probably the case. As he returned to work, Richard couldn't stop thinking about how a simple corporate decision, cutting childcare assistance, had resulted in children hiding in dark storage rooms, scared and hungry. How distant had he been from the reality of his own employees? That afternoon, while cleaning Charles Lane's office during the manager's lunch break, Richard made a disturbing discovery. A folder left open on the desk contained manipulated financial reports. Quickly comparing them with his knowledge of the store's real numbers, Richard realized that Charles was not just inflating results, he was actively embezzling money. The scheme was sophisticated and explained why Store 101, despite the high pressure for productivity, never achieved truly exceptional results. Charles systematically diverted a portion of the profits, using a complex system of duplicated invoices and falsified loss reports. Richard discreetly photographed some pages with his cell phone, feeling a mixture of anger and disappointment. It wasn't enough for Charles to mistreat employees, he was also stealing from the company. But the discovery, though important, only confirmed what Richard already suspected. Store 101 was sick, and Charles Lane was merely a symptom, not the cause. The true disease was the culture that he himself, Richard, had created and nurtured over the years. A culture that valued numbers above people, that saw employees as replaceable parts in a large money-making machine. "What are you doing here?" "Charles." Lane's sharp voice startled him from his thoughts. Richard turned, finding the manager at the office door, his face contorted in suspicion. "Routine cleaning, Mr. Lane," Richard replied, in the role of Roger, "as I do every day at this time." Charles's eyes narrowed, fixing on the open folder on the desk. "You were going through my documents," he accused, his voice dangerously calm. "No, sir," Richard lied. "Just dusting, as always." Charles approached, invading Richard's personal space. "Do you know what happens to employees who don't respect privacy?" The threat was clear, and Richard felt a wave of indignation. How many employees had already been intimidated in this way by this man? "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Lane," Richard insisted, maintaining the role of a submissive employee while taking a step back. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to clean, not to read," Charles retorted, slamming the folder shut. "From now on, you only clean my office when I'm present, and if I find out you've mentioned anything you might have seen here to anyone." The threat hung in the air, more intimidating for being unfinished. "Understood, sir," Richard replied, lowering his head in a show of submission that inwardly revolted him. Charles watched him for a few more moments before ordering, "Now get out." Richard left, feeling Charles's gaze burning on his back. The situation had become more complicated. The manager was suspicious, and that could put the entire investigation at risk. Later that day, while checking on Lucy in the cleaning team's office, Richard found Julianne already there, hugging her daughter. "Roger," she said, surprised. "Norman told me where Lucy was. Thank you for taking care of her." "It was nothing," he replied genuinely. "No one should have to hide in dark storage rooms." "Roger brought me a sandwich and juice," Lucy exclaimed, excited. And pencils. To draw. Look what I made, Mom. Julianne examined the colorful drawing her daughter showed her, a simple representation of 3 smiling figures, holding hands. Who are they? She asked, smiling. You, me, and Uncle Roger, Lucy replied with the innocence characteristic of her age. Richard felt something strange in his chest, a tightness he couldn't fully identify. He was getting emotionally involved with those people, something he hadn't planned. It's beautiful, honey, Julianne said before turning to Richard. Seriously, I don't know how to thank you. This was far beyond what anyone would do for us. It was nothing, really, he replied, feeling uncomfortable with the gratitude. After all, he was partly responsible for the situation they were in. Julianne studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher something. There's something different about you, Roger. You don't seem to belong here. Richard tensed slightly. Was his disguise that obvious? What do you mean? He asked, trying to sound casual. I can't explain it, Julianne continued. It's the way you speak, the way you move. You seem out of place, like someone who's had more in life. Richard laughed nervously. Well, I've had better days, that's true. But who hasn't? Before Julianne could press the issue, Richard's walkie-talkie crackled with Norman's voice urgently calling him. Roger, emergency in aisle 8, big spill. Come quick! I have to go, he said, relieved by the interruption. Stay here as long as you need. No one comes into this room besides the cleaning crew. Thank you, Julianne repeated, with a look that said much more than words could express. As he left, Richard felt the weight of all the lies he was telling. Lying to Charles Lane was one thing. Lying to Julianne and Lucy was completely different and increasingly difficult. The emergency in aisle 8 was, in fact, a simple soda spill, easily resolved in minutes. But while cleaning, Richard noticed Charles Lane watching him intensely from a distance, like a predator studying its prey. In the days that followed, Richard noticed a subtle change in the store's atmosphere. Charles seemed more vigilant, more suspicious. Employees were called individually to his office and emerged pale, refusing to comment on what had been discussed. The level of palpable fear increased, and Richard suspected the manager was trying to discover if anyone knew about his financial manipulations. One morning, while cleaning the restrooms, Richard was surprised by Peter, the young stocker, who entered hastily, visibly disturbed. Roger, I need to talk to you, he said in a low voice, checking if they were truly alone. What's wrong, Peter? Mr. Lane is asking about you. He wants to know who you know in the store, who you talk to, what you do during breaks. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Why? I'm not sure, Peter replied nervously, but he seems obsessed. He said you're not who you say you are. The situation was worsening more rapidly than Richard had anticipated. Charles not only distrusted him, he was actively investigating him. Thank you for letting me know, Peter. Be careful, Roger. He's destroyed people for much less. After Peter left, Richard evaluated his options. He could end the investigation now, reveal his identity, and fire Charles Lane immediately. But something stopped him. It wasn't just Charles, it was the whole system. If he removed only the manager, another similar one could take his place, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Richard needed to fully understand the problem before he could solve it. During lunch, Richard sought out Julianne, finding her in the same isolated corner of the cafeteria where she usually sat. May I? He asked, indicating the seat opposite her. Julianne nodded, looking worried. Is everything okay? You seem tense. Richard hesitated before deciding to be partially honest. Mr. Lane is investigating me. I think he suspects something. Julianne's eyes widened. Why? What did you do? Nothing exactly. But I think he noticed that I ask too many questions, that I pay too much attention. Julianne lowered her voice even further. Roger, there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to be honest. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. What? Are you some kind of inspector or auditor in disguise, sent by headquarters to investigate the store? The question caught Richard by surprise. It wasn't far from the truth, but it was still a lie. Why do you think that? He deflected. Because of the way you observe everything, the way you ask questions, the way you seem to understand how the company works, even though you just arrived. And Mr. Lane has been paranoid since you appeared. He always gets like this when inspectors from headquarters come. Richard considered his options. A partial lie would be easier to maintain than the complete charade of Roger. I can neither confirm nor deny, he finally replied, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. Julianne nodded, as if the non-answer was enough of a response. Whatever is going on, be careful. Mr. Lane isn't just cruel, he's dangerous. I've seen what he does to those who threaten him. What do you mean? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Last year, an employee, Amanda, threatened to report him for harassment. She was fired for just cause the same week, accused of theft. We all knew it was a lie, but no one dared to defend her. Richard felt anger grow within him. How many injustices had happened under his command, while he remained oblivious in his luxurious office? Thank you for telling me, he said sincerely. And for worrying. I promise I'll be careful. That afternoon, Richard was called to Charles Lane's office. His heart raced, but he maintained his calm exterior as he entered the manager's office. Close the door, Charles ordered, sitting behind his desk, his fingers intertwined in front of him. Richard obeyed, mentally preparing for any confrontation. Do you know why I called you here, Roger? Charles asked, the name sounding like an accusation on his lips. No, Mr. Lane, Richard replied, maintaining the role of a submissive employee. I've been checking your background. It's curious how a man your age, with no prior retail experience, suddenly decides to move to New York City and work as a cleaner. Richard maintained a neutral expression. I needed a fresh start after my divorce. New York City seemed like a good place. And why choose this specific store? There are hundreds of establishments in this city. It was the first one that accepted me, Richard replied simply. Charles studied him for long seconds before continuing. Do you know what else is curious? How quickly you became close to certain employees. Julianne, for example. Richard felt an internal alarm sound. Charles was trying to intimidate him, but he was also sending a clear message. Julianne was in his sights. I just try to be friendly with colleagues, he replied carefully. Friendly, Charles repeated with a cold smile. Well, friendly is not part of your job description. You are here to clean, not to make friends or investigate. The last word was emphasized, and Richard knew that Charles suspected something more concrete than he had imagined. I'm not investigating anything. Mr. Lane, Richard said, maintaining a steady gaze. I hope not, because people who meddle where they shouldn't end up in trouble. A lot of trouble. The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. May I go now, sir? Richard asked, maintaining his composure. You may, for now. As he left the office, Richard knew his time was running out. Charles was growing increasingly suspicious, and soon he might discover his true identity. He needed to act faster. That night after work, Richard waited discreetly in the store's parking lot. When he saw Julianne leaving with Lucy, he approached, taking care not to startle them. Julianne, he called softly. She turned, surprised. Roger, what are you still doing here? I needed to talk to you. Away from the store. Julianne seemed to hesitate, instinctively clutching Lucy's hand a little tighter. Uncle Roger, the girl exclaimed, letting go of her mother and running to hug Richard. Lucy's spontaneous gesture seemed to break down Julianne's defenses, who smiled slightly. All right. We can talk while we walk to the bus stop. On the way, Richard went straight to the point. Mr. Lane called me today. He's investigating me and clearly suspects something. But the worst part is that he mentioned you in a way that worried me. Julianne stopped walking, her face pale. What did he say? Nothing specific, but he insinuated that he noticed our closeness and didn't like it. I'm afraid he might use it against you somehow. He can't fire me for having friends, Julianne argued, but her voice betrayed insecurity. We know he can invent any reason, Richard gently countered. You yourself told me about Amanda. Julianne nodded, thoughtful, holding Lucy's hand, who watched the conversation with attentive, very understanding eyes for her age. What do you suggest, then? She finally asked. Richard hesitated. What he was about to propose went beyond any professional boundary, but he saw no alternative. I think you and Lucy should stay away from the store for a few days. Ask for medical leave, perhaps, until I resolve this situation. Resolve how? Julianne asked, frowning. And how will I pay my bills if I don't work? I have no savings, Roger. I'll help, Richard offered impulsively. I have some savings. Julianne looked at him with renewed suspicion. Why? Why do you care so much? We barely know each other. The question caught Richard off guard. Why did he care so much? When he started this investigation, it was just a matter of principles, of understanding what was happening in his company. But now it had become personal. Julianne, Lucy, Peter, Norman, all had become real to him, not just numbers on a payroll. Because it's the right thing to do, he replied simply. Because you deserve more than this. Something in the sincerity of his words seemed to touch Julianne deeply. You're not just a cleaner, are you? She asked directly. Richard knew he was reaching the moment of truth. He couldn't keep lying to Julianne, not when he was asking her to trust him. No, he finally admitted. I'm not. So who are you really? Richard took a deep breath, preparing to reveal his true identity, when the sound of quick footsteps interrupted them. Turning, he saw Charles Lane approaching, his face contorted in an expression of malicious triumph. I knew it, the manager exclaimed. I knew there was something between you two. Richard instinctively stepped in front of Julianne and Lucy, protecting them. It's not what you're thinking, Charles, he said, dropping the Mr., a small but significant abandonment of the subordinate role. Charles noticed the subtle change, his eyes narrowing. You don't fool me, Roger, he said, making air quotes with his fingers as he pronounced the name. I've been watching you, asking questions, spying, getting close to certain employees. We're just talking, Julianne intervened, her voice trembling. There's no rule against that. But there are rules against many things, Charles retorted with a cruel smile. Like bringing children to the workplace, for example. Lucy cowered behind her mother, scared. Or falsifying resumes, Charles continued, looking directly at Richard. Because that's what you did, didn't you, Roger? Your background doesn't match. There's no Roger Green with your profile from upstate New York. I checked personally. Richard maintained a neutral expression, while his mind worked quickly. Charles had done his homework, but he still didn't know who Richard really was. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard replied calmly. It doesn't matter, Charles said with a shrug. Tomorrow you'll be fired. And as for you, Julianne, I suggest you start looking for another job. I don't tolerate employees who conspire behind my back. That was the last straw for Richard. Seeing Charles threaten Julianne, who was already suffering so much just for having talked to him, was too much. You won't fire anyone, Charles, he said, his voice taking on a tone of authority that surprised everyone, including himself. Charles laughed, incredulous. And who's going to stop me? You the fake cleaner? No, Richard replied, straightening his shoulders and completely dropping the mask of Roger. I, Richard Maxwell, CEO and owner of Maxwell Markets. The silence that followed was absolute. Charles visibly paled, his face changing from arrogant to terrified in seconds. Julianne gasped, bringing her hand to her mouth in shock. That's impossible, Charles stammered finally. Richard Maxwell is... It's me, Richard confirmed, pulling out his real wallet with his true documents. And I've been investigating this store for weeks, after receiving complaints about your behavior. I can explain, Charles began, his tone now completely different, submissive and terrified. There's nothing to explain, Richard cut in coldly. I've seen enough. The systematic abuse of employees, the manipulation of reports, the embezzlement of money. The mention of embezzlement made Charles take a step back. No, I never... I have proof, Richard interrupted again. I photographed the documents in your office. Julianne watched everything in shock, unable to fully process what was happening. Lucy, sensing the tension in the air, clutched her mother's legs, silent. Mr. Maxwell, please, Charles pleaded. All his arrogance evaporated. I can explain everything. It was just a misunderstanding. Enough of the lies, Charles, Richard said firmly. You're fired, effective immediately. And there will be a full investigation into your activities. Depending on what is found, there may be legal consequences. Charles opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water, before muttering, This will ruin my career. You ruined your own career, Richard replied, just as you ruined the lives of many employees under your supervision. Turning to Julianne, who was still looking at him in shock, Richard said more softly, I'm sorry for the lie. I needed to see the reality of the store with my own eyes, without the filter that usually accompanies official visits. Julianne shook her head, incredulous. You are? You are really? Yes, Richard confirmed with a sad smile. I'm the owner of the company. Lucy, still half hidden behind her mother, looked at Richard with wide eyes. So you're like everyone's boss? Despite the tension of the moment, Richard couldn't help but give a genuine smile to the girl. Something like that. Yes. Turning his attention back to Charles, who remained standing in shock, Richard again adopted an authoritative tone. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., I want you at the head office for a meeting with the legal department. Don't be late, and don't try to run. It would be much worse. Charles nodded mechanically before walking away, defeated. When he was far enough away, Julianne finally found her voice. Why? Why did you disguise yourself? Why did you work as a cleaner? You could have just sent an audit. Richard completed with a sad smile. It wouldn't have worked. Charles is smart. He would have hidden the evidence, lined everyone up, presented a perfect facade. So it was all a lie? Julianne asked, a tone of hurt in her voice. Our friendship, your concern for Lucy. No, Richard immediately replied, taking a step towards her. That was real. It is real. I started this investigation just wanting to understand what was happening at Store 101. But I ended up finding much more. I found the real people behind the numbers, the lives affected by my decisions. Julianne studied him for long moments, as if trying to see the real Richard behind all the layers. And now? She finally asked. What happens? Richard took a deep breath. Now real changes begin to happen, not just at Store 101, but throughout the entire chain. Looking at Lucy, who still watched him with innocent curiosity, Richard made a silent promise. No child should have to hide in dark storage rooms while her mother worked. Not in his company. Not anymore. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Charles Lane, Richard Maxwell was back in his office on the top floor of the Maxwell Markets headquarters building. But something had changed. It wasn't just the new arrangement of furniture or the plants that now decorated the previously sterile environment. It was something deeper, a change in Richard himself. In front of him on the desk was an extensive report on working conditions in all 230 stores of the chain. The investigation that began at Store 101 had expanded, revealing that although Charles Lane was an extreme case, similar problems existed at various levels throughout the company. Mr. Maxwell, the human resources team is waiting for the meeting. Renee, his secretary, announced through the half-open door. Thank you. Renee, I'm coming, he replied, standing up and adjusting his well-cut suit. He no longer wore the cleaner's uniform, but he carried with him the memories and lessons of those weeks. In the meeting room, the HR team awaited, along with the company's main directors. All seemed slightly apprehensive, as if they sensed the changes that were to come. The story of the disguised CEO had already spread through the corporate corridors, becoming almost legendary, although few knew the complete details. Good morning, everyone, Richard began with a seriousness that commanded immediate silence. So in recent weeks, I did something I should have done a long time ago. I got to know my own company, not through reports or official visits, but by living the reality of our frontline employees. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. What I discovered, Richard continued, was deeply disturbing. A culture of fear, abuse, excessive pressure. A company where humanity was sacrificed on the altar of efficiency and profit. He paused, letting his words sink in. And the most disturbing thing is that it was I, with my distant and cold leadership, who created the conditions for this to happen. My relentless focus on numbers, my indifference to the real people behind those numbers, allowed managers like Charles Lane to prosper. Frederick Miller, the financial director, cleared his throat before interrupting. Richard, with all due respect, Maxwell Markets is a success story in American retail. Our efficiency policies have made us market leaders. Some isolated irregularities should not justify a complete overhaul of our strategy. Richard looked at Frederick with a gaze that mixed understanding and firmness. Frederick, until a few weeks ago I would say exactly the same thing. But what I experienced was not isolated irregularities. It was the natural result of a culture we put into practice. And yes, that culture made us financially successful, but at what cost? No one answered, and Richard continued. Starting today, we will begin a profound transformation at Maxwell Markets, not just in our policies but in our culture. Efficiency and profit will remain important, but not at the expense of our humanity. Over the next 2 hours, Richard presented a comprehensive plan of reforms, reintroduction of childcare assistance, realistic productivity targets, anonymous reporting channels that went directly to the president, improvements in working conditions, a development program for managers focused on humanized leadership, among other measures. Some executives seemed skeptical, others clearly concerned about the costs involved, but no one dared to directly question the evident determination in Richard's eyes. To conclude, he said, "I want to introduce the person who will lead many of these changes." The meeting room door opened and Julianne entered. Wearing formal clothes instead of the cashier's uniform everyone was accustomed to seeing her in. "This is Julianne Roberts," Richard introduced, "our new Director of Employee Well-Being and Experience. Julianne knows our company inside and out, having worked as a cashier for 3 years. Her perspective will be invaluable in ensuring that our policies reflect the real needs of our employees." The directors exchanged surprised glances. It was unprecedented in the company's history, such a dramatic promotion, from cashier directly to director. But no one dared to question the decision. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Maxwell," Julianne said with newfound confidence in her voice. "I promise to faithfully represent the perspective of those on the front lines." "I know you'll do an excellent job," Richard replied with a genuine smile. "And please call me Richard." After the meeting, Julianne remained in the room while the others left, many still processing the announced changes. "How do you feel?" Richard asked when they were alone. "Honestly?" "Terrified," Julianne admitted with a nervous laugh. "Until yesterday I was a cashier and now I'm a director. It seems unreal." "You are more than capable," Richard assured her. "You know the reality of the company. You have emotional intelligence, empathy, qualities that many career executives don't possess." Julianne nodded, still processing the drastic change in her life. "And how is Lucy?" Richard asked with genuine interest. Julianne's face lit up when she mentioned her daughter, adapting wonderfully to the new school. "The one with extracurricular activities until I get off work. She loves it, especially the art classes." "I'm happy to hear that," Richard replied sincerely. A comfortable silence settled between them before Julianne asked, "Why me, Richard? There are so many employees in the company, people more qualified, with more experience." Richard reflected for a moment before answering, "Because you taught me to see again, Julianne, to see the people behind the numbers, to understand that every employee has a story, a life, dreams, responsibilities, like Lucy, hiding in the storage room." "I still have difficulty reconciling the Roger I met with Richard Maxwell, billionaire CEO," Julianne confessed with a shy smile. "Sometimes." "I do too," Richard admitted. "But I believe Roger showed a side of me that had been dormant for a long time. A more human side, more connected with what truly matters." Julianne studied his face for a moment, as if looking for signs of the cleaner she had known in the features of the powerful businessman. "He's still there?" she finally said. "I can see it in your eyes." That same afternoon, Richard officially visited Store 101, now under new management. Margaret Stone, a long-time employee of the chain known for her firm but fair leadership, had taken over after Charles Lane's dismissal. The transformation was already visible. Employees smiled more naturally. The atmosphere was lighter. Efficiency had not decreased, but now it was built on more solid foundations. As he walked through the aisles as CEO, not as a cleaner, Richard noticed the looks of recognition, the whispers, the respect, but there was something different this time. It wasn't the reverential fear that usually accompanied him, but something more genuine. In the employee break area, recently renovated to offer more comfort, Richard found Norman, the cleaning supervisor, who had been his boss during his undercover investigation. "Mr. Maxwell," Norman said, standing up respectfully, but without the dread others had shown before. "Norman," Richard replied with a smile. "How's work with the new management?" "Quite a change, sir," the older man replied, relaxing slightly. "Miss Stone really cares about the team. She asks how we are, checks if we have what we need to work well. Small things, you know, but they make all the difference." Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. "And the new policies? The uniform subsidy, the increase in meal vouchers?" "They made many smile, sir," Norman replied with simple honesty. "Especially the childcare assistants. We have many single mothers on the team. Not having to choose between working and taking care of their children, that changes lives." Richard felt a wave of genuine satisfaction. The changes implemented were not just to appease his conscience. They were truly positively impacting the lives of real people. "Mr. Maxwell?" Norman called out as Richard was already walking away. "Yes?" "Here's our notice. You did a good job as a cleaner. For someone who had never done it before, you learned quickly." Richard laughed, appreciating Norman's direct honesty. "I had a good supervisor." At the end of that day, Richard drove to Julianne's new apartment, a much more spacious and well-located place than her previous one. It had been his suggestion after her promotion, but Julianne had insisted on paying the rent with her own salary, a demonstration of independence he deeply admired. Lucy opened the door, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Uncle Richard!" she exclaimed, jumping to hug him. "Did you bring the pencils you promised?" "Of course," he replied, handing her a case of professional colored pencils. "Serious artists need serious equipment." Lucy took the case with reverence, her eyes shining. "I'm going to draw something special for you." Julianne appeared in the hallway, smiling to see her daughter so excited. "You didn't have to spoil her so much," she said, but her tone was affectionate. "It's a small investment in her talent," Richard replied, entering the comfortably furnished apartment. In the living room on the table were scattered documents and spreadsheets that Julianne was clearly studying before his arrival. "Working late?" he asked, indicating the papers. "Trying to fully understand the current benefit structure before proposing changes," she explained. "I want to make sure our reforms are substantial, not just cosmetic." Richard smiled, appreciating her dedication. "Speaking of reforms, the board approved all the proposals we presented, including the continuing education program for employees." "That's wonderful," Julianne exclaimed. "So many employees dream of going back to school, but don't have the financial means or available time." Lucy returned to the living room, already with a drawing in progress, sitting on the rug to work on her artwork. "How was your first day as director?" Richard asked, sitting on the sofa. Julianne sighed, sitting beside him. "Intense. Some older directors clearly resent my presence. They think I don't deserve to be there, that it was favoritism." "It's normal," Richard replied calmly. "Prove your worth with actions, not words. Soon they'll see why you're in that position." "I'm trying," she said, "but it's intimidating. All that corporate world, the meetings, the technical terms. You'll learn, and you'll bring something that many of them never had. A real perspective from someone who's been on the front line." Julianne smiled, grateful for the support. "I never imagined my life would change so much in so little time. 2 months ago, I was hiding my daughter in storage rooms, trembling with fear of losing my job. And now you're helping to transform one of the largest companies in the United States," Richard completed. "Thanks to you," she said, her gaze meeting his. "Thank you, Richard, not just for the promotion, but for seeing humanity when others saw only numbers." "I thank you," he replied sincerely. "You and Lucy gave me back something I had lost a long time ago." "What?" she asked, curious. "Purpose," Richard replied simply. "You reminded me why I built this company in the first place. It wasn't just for profits or power, but to make a difference, create opportunities, build something meaningful." Lucy approached, proudly extending her drawing. "I finished," she announced, displaying a colorful representation of 3 figures holding hands, a woman, a girl, and a man, in front of what looked like a large building with the Maxwell Markets logo. "It's beautiful." "Lucy," Richard said, genuinely impressed with the girl's talent. "It's us," she explained, pointing to the figures. "You, me, and Mommy. And this is the store where you work. But now it's a happy place." Richard and Julianne exchanged an emotional glance, touched by the child's simple yet profound perception. "Yes, Lucy," Richard said, his voice slightly choked. "Now it's a happy place, and we're going to make sure it stays that way." That night, as they dined together, a new sense of family was forming. Improvised, unexpected, but deeply genuine. Richard realized that, in his quest to understand his company, he had found much more: a new purpose, new connections, a chance for redemption. It wasn't just the company that was being transformed, it was he himself. The cold, calculating man who had built an empire was giving way to someone more human, more connected, more present. And ironically, this transformation did not weaken his business, but strengthened it, building more solid foundations of loyalty and shared purpose. In the months that followed, Maxwell Markets underwent a metamorphosis. The changes initially implemented at Store 101 spread throughout the entire chain. The return of childcare assistants meant that no other child would need to hide in dark storage rooms. The development program for managers, focused on humanized leadership, gradually replaced the culture of fear with one of mutual respect. Charles Lane faced legal consequences for his financial manipulations, but Richard chose not to publicly disclose the case, avoiding exposing the company to unnecessary scandals. Instead, he strengthened internal control and transparency systems so that no other manager could abuse their position in the same way. Richard also changed his own routine. He began to regularly visit the stores, not just for official pre-announced inspections, but for surprise visits, talking directly with employees at all levels. His office, once an isolated fortress on the top floor, now had open doors for anyone who needed to speak directly with him. The specialized press noted the transformation. Maxwell Markets, once known primarily for its relentless efficiency, began to be cited as an example of a company that managed to balance financial results with social responsibility and employee well-being. What most surprised many analysts was that, contrary to the pessimistic predictions of some more traditional executives, financial results did not suffer. After an initial adjustment period, productivity even increased, driven by more motivated and engaged employees. Staff turnover decreased drastically, reducing recruitment and training costs. Customer service improved, resulting in greater loyalty and better reviews. For Richard, however, numbers, though important, were no longer the sole indicator of success. On a Saturday morning, 6 months after his undercover investigation, he walked through Central Park alongside Julianne and Lucy. The girl ran ahead, enchanted by the birds and flowers, while the adults chatted peacefully. "The board approved your new extended parental leave program," Richard commented. It was an impressive presentation. Even Frederick, always concerned about costs, voted in favor. Julianne smiled, proud of her achievement. "I presented solid numbers. The reduction in turnover amply offsets the cost of the benefit. But the most important thing is the message we are sending. We value families." "Your influence on the company has been transformative," Richard said sincerely. "You bring a perspective that was missing in our leadership." "I just apply what I learned in practice," she replied modestly. "So knowing the real needs of employees makes all the difference when creating policies that will directly affect them." Richard nodded, watching Lucy, who was now feeding some ducks in a nearby pond. "She's so happy," he commented. "So different from that scared little girl I found hiding among boxes." "We are all different," Julianne replied, her gaze meeting Richard's. "Life has transformed us in recent months. For the better, I believe." "Without a doubt," he agreed, gently taking her hand. The gesture, simple but full of meaning, marked yet another transformation in both their lives. What had begun as a corporate investigation had blossomed into something deeper, more personal. Not just a friendship, but the beginning of something neither of them had planned or foreseen. Watching Lucy run freely through the park, Richard reflected on the many lives transformed by a simple decision, stepping out of his comfort zone and seeing the world through other eyes. The girl who once hid in fear now played under the sun. The mother who lived in constant anxiety now held a leadership position, positively influencing thousands of lives. And he, the distant and cold CEO, had rediscovered his humanity. The anonymous message he had received months ago, "See what's happening at your store 101, had triggered much more than a simple corporate investigation. It had initiated a journey of rediscovery, reconnection, and redemption. "You know what?" Richard said, as they watched Lucy run happily across the lawn. "I think we should thank whoever sent that anonymous message." Julianne smiled, lightly squeezing his hand. "You never found out who it was?" Richard shook his head. "No, and perhaps it's better that way. Claire's mysterious messenger who changed our lives." Lucy ran back to them, her curly hair blowing in the wind, holding something in her small hands. "Look!" she exclaimed, opening her hands to reveal a small blue feather. "Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?" "It's beautiful," Richard agreed, crouching down to get a better look at the treasure the girl had found. "I'm going to keep it forever," Lucy decided, with the seriousness that only children can have about small things. "To remember this perfect day." Julianne smiled, touched by the simplicity of her daughter's happiness. Sometimes the best things in life are the simplest, aren't they? Richard nodded, standing up and looking at the two of them. The brilliant executive who had emerged from the scared supermarket cashier, and the brave little girl who had touched his hardened heart. Yes, he agreed, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years, the simplest and the most valuable. At that moment, under the blue sky of New York City, among the trees in the park, Richard Maxwell, the man who had built an empire based on numbers and efficiency, finally understood the most important lesson of all, that companies, in the end, are not made of spreadsheets, strategies, or metrics, but of people with dreams, needs, fears, and hopes, and that his greatest legacy would not be the profits generated or the size of the empire built, but the lives touched and transformed along the way. Store 101 had been just the beginning. The real journey of his company and of his life was just beginning, and this time it would be built on more solid foundations: respect, empathy, and humanity. And as they walked through the park, hand in hand as the improvised family they had become, Richard knew with absolute certainty that he was finally on the right path. Not just as CEO, but as a human being. Dear viewers, we hope that the story of Richard, Julianne, and Lucy has touched your hearts. This journey of transformation reminds us that it's never too late to change, to see beyond appearances, and to recognize the value of humanity in every person. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Tell us in the comments, what lessons did you take from this story? Which city are you watching from? We have prepared many other inspiring narratives that explore the complexities of human relationships and the possibilities of redemption. Share this video with someone who needs to remember the power of a second chance. Until the next story,